Blasphemous 2 is just as good as the original. Today I want to go over the story of Blasphemous 2 to figure out what's really going on here, as well as critique its quality along the way, as I have quite a few things to say about this game's story. We have a lot to talk about though, so I don't want to take up more time than necessary. Before we begin though, a huge shout out to Team 17 for providing me an early code so I can have some extra time to dissect the game's narrative, and obviously spoiler warning ahead. We're going to be talking about this game and its previous installment in full, so come back once you finished your playthrough. If you need a quick refresher on the first game, I made a video about it on the channel that will be linked in the eye in the top right or at the end of this video. With that out of the way though, let's get started. So Blasphemous 2 picks up right after the events of the previous game's DLC, Wounds of Eventide. As a brief recap, the Penitent One was sent by the Miracle to replace Escobar and continue the cycle of worship. But with the new DLC, we learn that the Miracle was actually being controlled by the High Wills, another godlike entity, but they had also underestimated the Penitent One, who with the help of Chrysanta was able to defeat them. Thanks to the High Wills dying though, all their creations went with it, which is why the Twisted One, or the very first Miracle, the Penitent One, and their sword, the Mea Culpa, all died with it. The final scene we saw for the game was a giant heart housing a being inside it that towered over the land of Custodia. Blasphemous 2 elaborates on this in the opening cutscene, as we first see Chrysanta bleeding before stabbing herself with her sword. Right near her is another being who at the moment doesn't have a name, but we'll soon learn is Evaterno. Shortly after, we hear that the city of the blessed name rose up to the sky, being held by 3 statues. Above the city is the same giant heart from the previous game, and the opening dialogue says that the Miracle is about to give birth to a new child. As if we needed to add more confusion to the mix, the following scene shows the Penitent One waking from his coffin. So already we have a lot of questions and not a lot of answers, and unfortunately we won't be getting those answers for a while. Holding his coffin though is Deo Gracias, and a statue of him we find later tells us that he was to watch over the casket of the Penitent One until he arises, meaning he sat beside us until he died. These statues are part of the game's upgrade abilities, but like most items in the game, they have lore descriptions that fill in lots of details about the world that the game doesn't outright tell us, which is where the bulk of our information is going to come from. On top of Deo Gracias, the Mea Culpa is also gone. Fortunately, we have a new selection of weapons to choose from. The new weapons follow the standard archetypes of high damage, low speed, low damage, and a balanced third option. These not only enhance the gameplay and give the player more freedom, but they also add to one of the core parts of Blasphemous' gameplay, the exploration. After choosing our weapon, we can test its effectiveness on the very first boss, the Faceless One Chisel of Oblivion. Sadly, there isn't really much to say about this specific boss, as it's not like in the first game where the first boss comes back as a regular enemy towards the latter half of the game, as you never see a being like this ever again, so I really just think it's an excuse to throw a boss in super early so that we can test our weapon. The design of this location is interesting though, as it's called the Repose of the Silent One, referring to the final resting place of the Penitent One. But judging by the statues everywhere, it seems like he was revered by many, likely because of his past deeds thanks to him saving Custodia from the torment of the High Wills, while also helping out the NPCs with their personal issues. Speaking of Custodia, a natural thing to be asking right now would be how long it's been since the previous game. And it seems like it's been a very long time, as under the main town is a location called the Mother of Mothers, the same place in Blasphemous 1. In the original, the Mother of Mothers church was opulent and large, but now it's extremely run down and abandoned. It serves as a nice thematic representation of the world, as the church used to be one of the highest locations in the game, but now it's almost the lowest point the player could reach. It's also a nice nostalgia trip for those that played the first game, as the tree that sprouted from the first Miracle is still here but much more withered than before, and quite a few items have descriptions that talk about old characters like Esdras and Rendento. The church being this run down though does show how long it's been since the first game, and also how many people have decided to move on without the Miracle. Its influence over Custodia was cut thanks to the Penitent One, so many of its worshippers stopped believing in it after going years without answers to their prayers. And in the case of Blasphemous, a god's life and power are based on their influence, so the Miracle losing their power is akin to not existing. That's what leads me to believe that the time between the High Wills dying and the heart appearing in the sky is a lot longer than the game makes it out to be, as the Miracle disappeared for quite a bit of time in between games. Outside the cave though is a woman named Annunciata who has a task for us. The Miracle is about to give birth to a new child above the city of the blessed name, and she wants us to stop it. To do this, we're going to need to find something called the 3 Regrets and then ascend to the highest of peaks in order to reach the heart, but stopping us is an Confraternities of penitents who serve as the Miracle Sentinels. Their specific names are Orospina, Benedicta, Odon, Lesmus, and Evaterno, the father of the penitents. You'll notice very quickly that a lot of Blasphemous 2's structure is similar to that of the first game. Before we had to find the 3 humiliations, which gave us access to the second half of the game, but now the humiliations have been replaced with the 3 regrets. And this continues on to the next area, as the city, and by extension this whole game, is host to all manner of strange individuals. The health vendor is a large woman who seems normal at first, but over time seems to have her skin peeled off by the cherubs that fly around her. Or there's the magical vendor who's a literal talking hand. But somehow that's not even the strangest thing about this game. as the ones that I think are tied for first are the guy whose body is filled with honey and the other NPC named Cesario who has a stitched on breast that can somehow lactate. Similar to Blasphemous 1 though, there is a consistency amongst the NPCs and bosses, and that's that the miracle is punishing them, sometimes with purpose, other times unnecessarily. We'll delve into the bosses soon, but some NPCs like the aforementioned Honeycomb Man are unsure what they did to deserve this fate. Others, though, are aware of why, such as Cesario, who cut off his own wife's breast in hope that the miracle could recognize his devotion to feeding his child, as well as Costo, who robbed many people and as a result became a deformity. It seems like the miracle is doing what it did in the first game, where it's blessing some and cursing others, but the manifestations this time around are all curses. Yeah, it's punishing those that did bad things, but it hasn't granted someone something for being kind. It's just punishment after punishment, whether it's unjust or not. The horrific imagery here has certainly been turned up a notch in this entry, as every one of these beings is just grotesque in their own way. But that grotesqueness is actually what got me interested in them in the first place, as a questline revolving around a guy with a stitched on breast surely has to go somewhere. Pretty much every NPC had me going, that's some of the most absurd shit I've ever seen. I wonder where this goes. And from a honeycomb man to a talking hand to a full-on riddle in a sealed envelope, all of the NPCs and discovery adds to the exploration of the game and intrigued me immensely. But I think a large reason why this was all so bizarre to me is that I lack the cultural context. Another character who was equally as disturbing was Jocinero from the first game. He was a giant cherub who was seen standing inside the recently split open corpse of a bull. Many of you in the comments pointed out to me that this was a reference to a bull of the same name that had killed a bullfighter back in the 1800s. While that specific detail didn't help piece together the story of Blasphemous, it did at least explain why there was a dead bull right in front of me. I say this because I'm almost certain the devs are doing the same thing again, as the Kobihara is an exact reference to the same outfit. The first time we meet her, she asks us to find her sisters who are also dressed in similar clothing. The Kobihara though is actually a real outfit that gained some popularity in the 16th century, where women would cover everything but one of their eyes. It seems to have become a lost tradition at this point thanks to being outlawed in the 1900s, but the town of Viger in Spain seems to still utilize it as there's a statue near one of the town's castles. While I can find some of the references, a lot of them are lost on me as I'm not well versed in Christianity, especially the Spanish side of it. So like the last video, if a boss's name or NPC's design sticks out to you, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear about it. Continuing from where we left off though, it's time to tackle the 3 regrets. The 3 bosses that hold these are Radames, Lesmes, and Orospina. You'll recognize the last 2 as they are the 2 of the 5 penitents that Anuntiata spoke of, so we're already 40% of the way through our hit list. Seeing as the game is a Metroidvania though, we're able to tackle these bosses in any order we wish, so we'll discuss them in the order I took them on. Radames was the confessor of the monastery he worked at. He was tasked with hearing the guilt and sins of all the monks who came to absolve themselves of it, so that they can continue their lives free of sin. After enough time he started to grow old and feeble, but due to the generations of guilt and sin he had heard, it somehow kept him alive. He no longer needed the basic necessities that other humans would need like food, water, or sleep. He didn't even experience pain or pleasure either, only the burden of those that spoke to him only existed inside his body. The monks had taken advantage of this and used the confessor as a tool and a prisoner in their sacraments. It became too much for him to bear though, as after enough time, thousands of voices sprouted from his body speaking all kinds of sins and guilt, likely the same ones people told him throughout the years. The sound was so deafening that it eroded the very walls of the monastery, causing it to collapse. Almost as if the sins themselves wanted to be buried, which is why the area surrounding it is covered in sand. After defeating Radames, we're taken into the dream and we can see what his true form is. Most of his dialogue is just repeating what we had just talked about, with the added line that he was tasked with guarding the miracle's sacred regret. This is referring to the cutscene that follows this conversation. This specific scene is actually split into 3 parts, with each part belonging to each regret, so we'll circle back to this in just a moment. The second regret is obtained from Lesmes, the incorrupt sacristan. Halfway through the fight though, he's joined by another boss called the Sleeping Infanta. According to his statue item description, he was decapitated by a few inquisitors for crimes unknown. He is specifically called a martyr in the text, so maybe he went against the head of the church at the time. Either way, while his head rolled across the ground, the inquisitors were too focused on making sure that judgment was passed, that they didn't notice that a little girl had taken his head and ran away. She decided to take the head to an abandoned church and place it in an urn that used to hold old relics. Going off Lesmes' intro dialogue, we can assume that the miracle had reanimated his head and attached it to his metallic body that he now inhabits. In fact, you can actually see his real head in the stomach of the armor. You get the sense that Lesmes doesn't want this though, as he states that it feels like he's being directed by other forces to carry out their wills. His full name also ties back into this idea, as incorrupt is likely related to incorruptibility, which is the belief that some people's corpses don't decompose due to their immense and holy devotion to God. And Lesmes is sort of incorruptible thanks to the miracle. It's honestly pretty compelling and shows how toxic the miracle has become. It's doing the exact same thing the High Wills did with it back in the first game. It's causing chaos by granting certain wishes and prayers even if they don't make sense. As for the sleeping Infanta, well, I think it's safe to assume that this is the girl who took his head when he was decapitated. Her name also seems to be Liviana, as you can find a spell of her blade attack that she uses throughout the fight, and the word Sleeping Infanta is used in the description, with the name Liviana being the name of the spell itself. I do also have an additional theory regarding Lesmus, although it's a bit spotty even for my standards. My theory is that Lesmus is either related to or is Cubiertos from the first game. My main reasoning is that out of both games, they're the only two bosses that have this Pillar of Fire attack. In addition to Cubiertos' own dialogue, which is about him being burned to death by various inquisitors, who was also seen as a martyr. Furthermore, the miracle, just like Lesmus, reanimated him by constantly reviving his body whenever the flames would kill him. Cubiertos also has his own San Benito, which is the pointed helmet all the penitents wear, except his was made of cloth, which coincidentally is the same color as the cloth that hangs from Lesmus in the dream after the fight. It does sound like a lot of evidence, but it's not perfect. Now, if I recall, I do believe that Lesmus was actually an unused boss from the first game that had a similar moveset to Cubiertos, which is why the two are so similar, as Lesmus was likely the first draft of what would become Cubiertos. Like a lot of this game though, many details are unclear, so just like the influences and religious references, if there's something I got incorrect or you have a different interpretation of, feel free to let me know in the comments down below. Regardless, I've always liked seeing prior games' concept art and cut content be fully realized in a sequel, as it's a nice callback for fans who remember the old games, and Lesmus is no exception. Our final boss is our second of 5 penitents, Ospina, from the Confraternity of the Embroiderers. Ospina is kinda disturbing, as she mentions how anyone who enters her domain is prey for her to toy with. Her statue description isn't even about a deep personal backstory, it's just a 3-paragraph tale about her toying with one of her victims that managed to survive their initial encounter. Talking about how the victim felt fear as he attempted to cling on to whatever life he had left, while Ospina laughed at his pain and suffering. The reason why people even come here is because many assume that it's abandoned and still filled with the riches that were left behind. Obviously, this isn't true, but Ospina doesn't seem too interested in dispelling the rumor that the Embroiderers are gone, as she seems to love hunting any unsuspecting foe who enters its halls. Like I said, it's not a really deep personal story like the previous two, as it's just a tale about her wanting to kill people, which is admittedly slightly disappointing, as the game doesn't even bother elaborating on what the miracle had to do with this. She could have been this sadistic from the start, but it's also possible that the miracle had changed her, but the miracle itself is never mentioned in anything related to her. A large reason why is because it's not the bosses themselves that are important here, but more so the cutscene we get after. They do add to the world building of the game though, but I feel like the statues and NPCs do that enough already. But afterwards is the final piece of the cutscene, which we now have the full story of, in addition to the city and the sky now being lowered to our level. One thing you'll have noticed is that the 3 regrets have images of 3 people, more specifically the father, the mother, and the child from the cutscene. Long ago, a married couple wanted to have kids, but due to certain circumstances, whether they be infertility or other health-related issues, they were unsuccessful. Eventually, after enough praying, the miracle heard their plea and the couple gave birth to a healthy boy, except he was maybe too healthy, as he was a full-grown man by the time he was born. Naturally, the mom died from the birth, but the others alongside them also seemed to have died due to some affliction. The miracle was disappointed in the lack of faith and devotion that had occurred during its absence, further confirming that it's been quite a while since the first game, so it saw its newest creation as a deformity. This is likely why we are gathering the regrets this time around, as the miracle might regret this act. The references here are pretty heavy-handed, as it's very clearly trying to relate this to the birth of Christ, as the setting and characters are practically the same. Mary is also known as the Virgin Mary, as she was impregnated by God through the Holy Spirit, implying that God had a hand in the pregnancy, the same way the miracle had a hand in this couple's pregnancy. It's also the Holy Trinity, but with a Blasphemous-style twist, as instead of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, it's the Father, Mother, and the Son, with the biggest difference being that it's not the ideal Holy Trinity that the miracle thought it out to be. The being that this couple gave birth to is called the Witness, and is actually someone we can talk to early on in the game. Underneath the Mother or Mother's Church, we find a being called the Filior, Sentinel of the Emery. After defeating them, we're sent into the dream again and are introduced to the Witness. He tells us that we are speaking to the narrative voice of the Witness, as his actual body is inside the golden urn right next to us. All of this though is admittedly really bizarre, as it's located in the lowest part of the map behind a random unknown boss, on top of the fact that this is one of the fights Yerma can help us with, which is someone I'll talk about later. But it's all really confusing, as I have no idea how any of these connect in any way. But we at least have our new objective, as the Witness wants us to find the keys that unlock the cages of the 5 doves that sit above his corpse. The first key is given to us by one of the pilgrims who is found here, but the rest are going to come from our hit list and then some. Just like the statues, the keys also provide us with information that is related to the being we got them from, like the aforementioned pilgrim who actually talks about the Witness. It says that one day the miracle melted glass in an urn and dressed it with gold so that it could properly display the body of the Witness. He was put into this urn so that he may be incorruptible, so that his testimony remains immortal. As for the rest of the keys though, they'll tell us the story of the other individuals who came with their own locations. The first to appear on our map is the Basilica of the Absent Faces, whose boss is Benedicta of the Endless Orison. The group was a large congregation of sisters who watched over the dead in perpetual prayer. It seemed to be an incredibly large group at that, as one sister would be dedicated to one person for the rest of their life. These women never prayed for anyone else but the person they were assigned to, and once they died, another sister would take their place so the prayers could continue. Just like any other typical night though, a new cardinal had arrived, but Benedicta must have sensed something different about this being, as they immediately whipped out a frayed scroll that would seal her fate. Apparently, whoever uttered the words written on this parchment would be imprisoned in eternal prayer, unable to stop until they died of starvation. To this day though, none of the sisters seem to know why she did such a thing, and it will likely never be known. Seeing as she is a defender of the miracle, I wonder if the miracle saw this devotion and decided to keep her alive, as it says that you're to pray until you die. The other sisters were able to take breaks and do normal everyday things, unlike Benedicta, where every waking moment was spent praying for this one cardinal. But seeing as she's still alive, it's possible that the miracle made her eternal in some way, so that she could pray for eternity. After her defeat, a new building arises from the Sea of Ink called the Sunken Cathedral, which houses Odon and his men. They were a group of sailors who traveled along the sea until a wave capsized their ship, causing them to sink into its dark, watery depths. What shocked the men is that not only did they arise shortly after, believing that they survived the crash, but they were also inside a giant cathedral. The men had looked to their captain Odon for guidance, who immediately knew that their new goal was to defend this place until death, as the salt here had granted them another chance at life. Our fourth key comes from Synoda, Hymn of the Thousand Voices, located in the Severed Tower. Oddly enough, the tower is upside down, but it seems like it was built with that in mind for some reason, as the miracle was the one that nailed it face down. Synodo, though, could be possibly derived from the word synod, which is an assembly of clergymen, which makes a lot more sense in the context of the boss. The main figurehead seems to be the old man who greets us upon starting the fight. He seemed to be a pontiff who was walking the halls of an ancient holy place that depicted the previous pontiffs of Custodia. He talked to these paintings and told them that one day they would all escape from their pieces and become one large colossal being full of ornaments and blessings, allowing them to sing their hymns for eternity as the miracle instructed. There are multiple references to paintings in this dialogue, which makes me believe that they're referring to Benedicta's congregation, as all the paintings located there are missing their faces. Whether or not that is true is unclear, and neither option really gives us anything to go off of anyway, seeing as the paintings are mentioned outside of this item description, but it might connect to why Synodo and Benedicta are both sentinels for the miracle. The final key was given to Zivonsa Formosa Fembra, which roughly translates to beautiful female. This boss is the only one who is connected to another NPC, Yerma. The key we get from the lady talks about how the palace could be seen in the reflection of the lake. It was shown to be ornate and beautiful, and thanks to the miracle, its reflection would stay that way even when it took a different shape. Even when the palace was crumbled and rotten, the reflection would display it as it used to be, almost like it had taken a picture. Due to its long decay, the bell from atop the highest tower actually sank to the bottom of the lake, never to be seen again. Until one day when the villagers noticed that the bell had returned. But by then, it was already too late, as when the bell tolled, the people's reflections were warped and changed into these hideous-looking beings. It was known as the Curse of the Bell, as these distorted images became reality, and the hideous forms they saw took shape on their own faces. As for Yerma, we first meet her near some dead soldiers who tells us that she's blinded by hatred. She doesn't tell us much after that, but we'll elaborate during our next talk by saying that her life has been a constant struggle due to her needing to fulfill a promise she was given. She then goes on to say that she was one of the people who were there when the bell tolled and turned people's faces into distorted and hideous creations. Yerma also states that while it was the bell that caused it, it was the lady's curse that prompted the bell to ring in the first place. The lady was obsessed with her own reflection, as she was already very beautiful, but she thought of herself as unnaturally divine. So she prayed that no one would be allowed to see their reflection within the lake, but that's when the bell rang and the curse started to spread. Our last talk with her is right outside the boss room, where she asks you to join up and take her down. You can choose to do this if you want to, but you'll need some holy oil first. To enter the room, you need to go into the lake's version of the boss room, which opens the door and shows us the lady sitting and screaming. If I had to give any advice, gameplay-wise within this video, please, for the love of the miracle, do not enter this room without giving Yerma the oil. I figured that because it wasn't the boss room, I'd be fine, but this opens the door and prompts Yerma to go inside, and if she doesn't have the oil, she'll die. Fortunately, nothing happens after the fight, as she just thanks you for helping her fulfill her promise, but I did have to do a whole new playthrough for this, which was annoying. Speaking of annoying, something about this lady's been nagging me all week, and I'm not sure what to make of it. Two other NPCs in this game reference another lady. Montanes calls her the most blessed lady, and Regula calls her a saint. The issue is that the names either NPC uses never overlap. Montanes calls the blessed lady extremely beautiful, and the saint Regula is referring to has an altar and a statue in her image. She also refers to her as beautiful in an item description. But none of their stories connect to the lady in the lake. Montanes is a sculptor who witnessed two men fighting before a woman came by to stop them, only to be killed as a result. A bright radiant light emanated from that scene, which blinded him, who despite not being able to see, is still able to remember the look of the blessed lady, who I assume was the woman was stabbed. His last and final task is capturing her image in a statue, which we can help him with. Regula was just a woman who wanted to try on a veil covered in makeup that was going to be used for the sculpture of the saint. It specifically refers to the sculpture as a sculptress, so it's clearly not Montanes. But regardless, after she took off the veil, she realized it had taken her face off. She did, however, accept the punishment for her sin and is now trying to keep the entrance to the sanctuary open so that the saint she is referring to may never be forgotten. The reason I'm so personally dumbfounded by this is I cannot tell if these are the same people. Realistically, it makes sense that the lady would be a saint as she was given a key that unlocks the birdcage for the witness, and she was considered extremely beautiful, but there isn't enough concrete evidence to say that this is a complete fact. Similar to my theory with Blasphemous, I don't consider it a fact, just my interpretation of things. I just wanted to lay out all the information anyway so you can come to your own conclusions. As a whole though, the bosses and the respective confraternities are great. There's also a nice amount of environmental storytelling within the locations that really bring the whole thing together, such as the numerous bodies that are strung up across Orospina's domain, or the gold oil and eroded walls in Sonodo and Odon's buildings. But I think my biggest complaint about the game has to come from these bosses, which I guess also shows how great the game is if my biggest problem is a nitpick like this. But a lot of the lore surrounding these bosses has some of the most extenuating set of circumstances I have ever seen with no real explanation as to why. Liviana just decided to take Blasphemous' head one day, and for what? And Benedicta decided that today of all days would be the time to use the Forbidden Scroll on this random cardinal. Blasphemous 1 had a lot of weird things too, but most of it was explained away using the miracle or some other explanation. Expósito, which is a child that was being cared for by a moving wicker basket, is strange, but its backstory connects back to the game. Even though most of it was thanks to the miracle's doing, it at least made sense when in the context of the High Will's goals. Most of these bosses are also penitents, yet I can't recall any of their penances being explained. I guess you could claim that guarding the regrets or the keys is their penance, which is a fair assumption, but it feels a lot less exciting than the penitent one's vow of silence or Chrysanta foregoing her sight. I did like what they did with Blasphemous and how the miracle seems to be controlling him against his will, but there's nothing like that with the other members. Orospina talks about killing, Benedicta wanted to join her in her endless orison, and Odon doesn't even speak. Either way, that's really my biggest issue with the story, as I wish we could learn more about these beings, and while I'm all for speculation and theory, you can only work with what you have, and it's not much. Returning to the story, once the lady is defeated, we get the fifth and final key and our final conversation with the witness. He claims to be given the opportunity by the miracle to narrate the events that transpired regarding the miracle's return. He says that the miracle wanted to create a new icon, as it had been eons since it left the land of Custodia and needed a way to gain back support. It was meant to be a symbol that would allow people to unite their faith so that they could expand its power, as it was almost extinct. Due to it lacking sufficient power though, it was only ever able to manifest itself in disease, deformity, and pain. This is likely why a lot of NPCs and some of the bosses seem to have been given terrible fates. One person though had asked for hope during all this pain and suffering, and through the miracle was able to create the heart in the sky. What this is referring to is the holy verses I mentioned earlier. Out of all the statues you could acquire throughout the game, 4 of them are specifically carrying golden cloths, and these statues also have item descriptions that are connected to each other. These holy verses talk about a malnourished child who made his way to what he called the Great City, but when he arrived he was filled with sadness, as this great city he had heard about was surrounded by misery and pain. Within all this suffering was the beautiful sky that was filled with streaks of orange and pink colors. The child was so enraptured by its beauty he daydreamed that the clouds molded themselves into a giant heart. From his wish, the miracle was able to take that and create a heart out of the sky containing its new child, and thus the miracle was given one last chance at worship. A lot of this is one of those just go with it and don't really think too hard about it kind of stories, especially when you consider that the child's identity is unknown. My first guess would be the witness, but seeing as Blasphemous has always been allergic to concrete info, I'm not too sure if that's true. Regardless, what's really important here is that last part of the verse, which talks about the child inside the heart being an incarnation of the miracle itself. A symbol in which all faith and worship from back then till now could be united. Basically, it's trying to create God, like the literal God, the one from the Bible. It's been known since the first game that the miracle has only ever been seen through its acts. Things like the Twisted One or the Plague of Albro were all acts of the miracle. Now, in actuality, we know it was the High Wills, but still we never saw the miracle, just what it did. But now the miracle wants to make a spokesperson or figurehead, if you will. To relate this to the real world, thanks to the appearance of God, Christians have someone to worship. Without him, they would just be worshipping his acts, but this is a central figurehead within the religion. This child is going to be that figurehead, someone to put a face to the name of the miracle. But since we have all the keys, we could stop the miracle from doing so, except stopping us is Eviterno, who is also next to Chrysanta. While the penitent one was dead, Chrysanta took the fight to the penitents we've been killing throughout the game. She seemed to understand that the heart in the sky was the miracle's child, so she tried to stop the miracle from giving birth. Unfortunately, Eviterno was too strong for Chrysanta and she was mortally wounded during their battle. As we know, the miracle had selected specific guardians to protect it while it was busy trying to birth the child, with Eviterno being the head of the group. His penance is actually something we know, which is one of eternal contemplation. He was basically told to wait until the miracle said so. Kind of a boring life if you ask me, but he doesn't seem to mind. As for Chrysanta, I think it's pretty obvious what happened. She tried to stop the penitents in the miracle, but died at the hands of Eviterno. I do have some additional comments about her due to one of the post-credit cutscenes, but I'm honestly kinda shocked how dirty the team did her in this game. She may not have started this way, but by the end of Blasphemous 1, she became quite the pivotal character. And seeing her only show up for 10 seconds in the intro and then die kinda sucks. With that said though, we can now take the fight to Eviterno, who has 2 phases, quite a few complex moves, and even summons the previous penitents for a brief moment. It's a really solid fight, and he without question lives up to his strength. Once that's done though, we can take Chrysanta's sword and finish off Eviterno while the miracle child is birthed. From here, there is only one thing left to do: ascend and take down the child.
Higher will, incorporeal and inscrutable fathers, I am the heir of your all-encompassing light.
This is the incarnate devotion, the final boss, the child of the miracle, and God itself. Remember when I said earlier how the miracle wanted, for a lack of a better word, a figurehead? This is what I was talking about. It literally calls itself the miracle's magnum opus. Just like when Christians think of God when they pray, the people of Custodia will think of this thing when they pray to the miracle. Is that terrifying to think about? Absolutely, but seeing as this place has a wealth of horrific creations, this is actually quite tame in comparison. This fight is also another great example of Blasphemous 2 mimicking the structure of the previous game, as not only are we killing a god again, but they also made the final boss easier than the penultimate boss. Escobar? Not a problem. Chrysanta? Drove me up the goddamn wall. I beat the Incarnate Devotion in 30 minutes, and I'm not even using that to brag, only as a comparison, as Eviterno took me 2 hours. I don't know what it is with this game in that specific situation, but it's happened twice now. That being said, the fight is fantastic. Just like in the first game, I had no issues with any of the bosses when it came to gameplay, and especially their design. The final boss is exactly the kind of thing I would think of if I were imagining a god, but in the world of Blasphemous. It's kind of like a biblically accurate angel, extremely holy but also incomprehensible and very terrifying. You'll also notice that we're attacking its heart, which could be a nod to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Once the boss has been defeated though, we're given our ending. If you've been blitzing through the game and didn't complete a specific task, you'll be given ending B, which is the bad ending. One thing that confuses the child is what its purpose is, which makes sense given it was just born, but through this trial by combat it learned what was expected of him. The miracle wants the child to combine itself with the penitent one to create a new being, a new god, and a new age for the miracle called the Second Psalm. Now there is a book called the Psalm, which is a part of the Bible, and I looked into the second book of Psalms just to see if there was anything to it, and there could be a connection here. From what I read, it seems like this specific passage is all about the rulers of the world trying to thwart God's rule over them. God is attempting to preserve this order of the world through his anointed one, which is Jesus. This perfectly mimics the miracle's actions of trying to create order within the chaotic world of Blasphemous through the child. Now, as I've stated, I only have a modicum of knowledge on this thing, so feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I do think the phrase Second Psalm was intentional in some way. Clearly though, that's not a good ending, as the penitent one is combined with the child of the miracle to create a new age, one whose future is uncertain but presumably not good. To get the good ending though, we have to go back a bit. You'll notice that while the door behind the mother is open, the father's isn't. That's because they'll only open when you follow the directions on the signs. The mother says to follow the heartbeats that heralded the birth, which is what we did. But the father's talks about 4 envoys wrapped in linen cloths. These are referring to the 4 golden statues that have the 4 holy verses. These can be acquired by completing tasks like Gregor's statue, which is found at the end of Proximo's questline. Once all 4 are found, the door will open and you need to equip them in order to use the furnace located inside, as the penitent one will put the statues in the furnace to create the incense of the envoys. Its description reads that these ashes will mark the owner worthy of the ultimate sacrifice, allowing them to ascend to the heavens, and that the presence of the envoys means absolution and the final step in the way of penitence. This connects to what happens after the fight, as instead of combining together, the Incarnate Devotion dies, and the penitent one is taken by the cherubs to what the game calls the Canvas of Light and Time, which I can only assume is heaven. Inside though are all of our comrades and friends from the past. Rendento, Perpetua, Esdras, the Guardian Visages, Jocinero, Sakuro, Soledad, Lady of the Six Sorrows, Deo Gracias, the Twisted One. Hell, I think Tirso and Viridiana are in there too, along with our new allies, the mother, father, and the child from the Three Regrets, Regula, Annunziata, and probably a couple others I'm forgetting. Point is, a lot of them are here, and were waiting for us. It's just a beautiful ending, but I really think the final line drives it home.
The penitence is thus complete.
We can now officially say that after everything we did, after killing 2 gods, being revived, and all the constant backtracking, we did it. We're done, and our penance is complete. I couldn't think of a better ending. All that's missing is Chrysanta. Fortunately, her time may not be over yet, as an after-credit cutscene shows a crimson ribbon similar to the one on her sword, implying that something related to her is soon to come. What this is unknown, but I do have some theories. I'm assuming this is hinting at some kind of DLC, whether that is us trying to revive Chrysanta during the events of the game, or maybe a DLC where we play as her. It could also be like Wounds of Eventide, in which a new ending is released that involves her. It's wishful thinking, but I think somehow reviving her and having her join us again and taking down another god only for both of them to ascend would be one of the greatest endings I've ever seen. Either way, that's all the content we have for now, which while filled with answers does have a lot of questions still left unanswered. My biggest question revolves around Annunziata herself. I have a firm belief that she was the one who revived the penitent one, as she's the first person we meet and is seen in the ending, so I'm assuming she revived us to prevent the miracle from succeeding. She claims to be from the holiest of places, likely the same place we just saw a moment ago, so maybe she had certain plans set in motion that the miracle was disrupting, or maybe she simply wanted it gone because it was causing havoc. She makes reference to something called the Eternal Pages, which seems to be some kind of book that has all the rules and events laid out like it's fate. So maybe she's just following what the pages say, but we're really delving into some vague territory with that one. Another question I personally have are these dream realms we visit a few times. The sleeping old woman that has us run through a few gauntlets and the one who wants us to find lullaby verses both have this odd dream realm that we go to, yet it's never brought up. Regardless, let me know what you thought about Blasphemous 2 as well as the video in the comments down below. Blasphemous 1 really shocked me back when I played it a year ago, and I'm really glad to be playing another entry so soon. As for what's next for the series, well, we'll have to wait and see. Either way, thank you for watching the video today, and I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like and subscribe if you're new and enjoy this style of story analysis content. And as always, thank you to my returning viewers for coming back to another video. Take care everyone. Goodbye.